Russian submarine fleets are always a mystery and almost a surprise in the world's seas. It is unclear where they will come from. So do we know where they were last seen, and the reason behind Putin's risky submarine gambling in the world's seas? Vladimir Putin continues to take a risky gamble, both in Eastern Europe and in the seas of the world. Putin, who took the biggest gamble of his political career by starting the Ukraine war, is losing this gamble heavily. Putin's three losing political identities and the drastic decline in the level of deterrence of the Russian army caused the Kremlin to make urgent action plans. The Russian Navy, which has been in dangerous elbow contact with different countries since the first day of the war, has again made a dangerous move. There was talk on the Pentagon's side that the deployment of desperately advancing Russian nuclear submarines to U.S. shores could threaten American security. The U.S. Navy is on alert about the activities of Russia's submarine fleet, possibly consisting of 3 to 6 pieces. Thousands of miles off the U.S. coast, U.S. Navy commanders have expressed concern that emerging patterns of deploying fleets of Russian nuclear submarines on U.S. coasts could threaten American security. This situation was also an indicator of a new crisis: the incessant spread of U.S. aid to Ukraine and the helplessness of the Russian army in the face of powerful U.S. weapons may have prompted Putin to make such a move. We all know that the activities of the Russian Navy cannot go beyond threats, even though it seems clear that Putin, who does not hesitate to threaten the West at every stage of the war, wants to create a new threat with this elbow contact. Russian submarines were also seen more frequently in the Mediterranean and near the U.S. coast, according to officials. This, along with Russia's preoccupation with the Ukraine war and the subsequent buildup of Russian forces and nuclear submarines in the Black Sea, is also increasing the temperature of the waters off the U.S. coast, the Baltics and the Arctic. The Russian Institute for Maritime Studies reports that there are indications that Russian nuclear-powered submarines have been deployed off the coast of the United States, in the Mediterranean, and elsewhere in Europe. It resembles the Soviet-style submarine tactics of the Russian Navy's deployments during the Cold War. Putin said his country would build more nuclear-powered submarines, quote, assuring Russia's security for decades. According to military experts, the exact scale of Russian nuclear submarine deployment remains unclear, but it has certainly seen a massive increase over the past 2 decades. In January of this year, the Russian Navy launched the Belgorod, the world's largest and most dangerous submarine equipped with Poseidon torpedoes, held as superweapons. This caused a brief increase in alert levels in all world navies. In the last 3 months, the steps of the Russian Navy to increase the Battle of the Atlantic have attracted a lot of attention. Also, at the end of January, the Russian frigate Admiral Gorshkov, the first warship converted to use Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles, was spotted moving towards the east coast of the United States. The Russian warship crossed half the Atlantic Ocean and was spotted 800 miles from Washington. The action of the Russian Navy did not seem dangerous or unusual. However, it worried Washington that the launch range of Zircon missiles could reach 2,000 kilometers. Also in January, the sighting of a Russian spy ship off the coast of Hawaii alarmed the U.S. Navy. In the first weeks of January, the U.S. Coast Guard tracked down a Russian vessel believed to be an intelligence-gathering vessel off the coast of the Hawaiian Islands. The U.S. Coast Guard said it was tracking a suspected Russian spy ship off the coast of Hawaii in international waters. As tensions escalated between Washington and Moscow over Russia's war in Ukraine, the U.S. Coast Guard said the situation was not unusual, but was monitoring it closely. The actions of Viktor Lenov, a Russian surveillance ship sailing off the coast of South Carolina and Florida, were determined to be unsafe as it did not use headlights in low-visibility weather and did not respond to merchant ships' attempts to communicate to avoid potential accidents. The U.S. Coast Guard said in a statement that although foreign military vessels may freely pass through the U.S. economic exclusive zone, foreign-flagged military vessels have generally been observed to operate and navigate within the response area of Coast Guard District 14, according to customary international law. As a result, the measures taken against Russia's aggression with the increasing tension in the Atlantic continued to threaten the global order with the effects of the Ukraine war. On the other hand, the Arctic has long been a key strategic preparation point for Russia's naval nuclear deterrent capabilities from Soviet times to the present. The primary mission of the Russian Navy remains strategic deterrence provided by the Navy's ballistic missile submarines based on the Northern and Pacific fleets. In this regard, an event focusing on how to deter Russia in the Arctic had brought together representatives of the US and Norwegian armed forces in Washington, D.C. The roundtable, organized by the Wilson Center's Polar Institute, focused on Russia's increasing prioritization of the Arctic region and how the United States and its partners, particularly Norway, could deter Russian aggression in the region. The commander of the U.S. Second Fleet, Vice Admiral Dwyer, stated that Russia is challenging the stability of the Arctic. In response, Russia issued its new maritime doctrine, which prioritized the Arctic as the most important maritime aspect and promised to protect these waters by all means. This doctrine included increased attention to the Arctic coastline, as well as the introduction of new missile capabilities to focus on the Northern Fleet's stronghold. But Russia, which is causing complete chaos in the Atlantic, is moving in the opposite direction with the doctrine it has published. So Russia's priorities have recently undergone a shift, with the Arctic crossing the Atlantic as Russia's main priority. In this time period, the Russians showed serious examples of aggression. Despite all this Russian aggression or reckless moves towards possible aggression, the U.S. military has declared that Russian activity in the North American Air Defense Identification Zone is occurring regularly and is not seen as a threat. In February, the USA and Russia came face to face in a non-dangerous way. The U.S. intercepted for Russian aircraft after the Alaskan North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, detected it over Alaska. NORAD said on February 13 that it detected, tracked, definitively identified, and intercepted for Russian aircraft that entered and operated in the Alaska Air Defense Identification Zone. As a result, Russian aircraft remained in international airspace and did not enter American or Canadian sovereign airspace. It was also stated that two NORAD's F-16 fighters intercepted Russian aircraft, including the Tu-95 Barrage and Su-35 warplanes. NORAD had anticipated this Russian activity and, as a result of their planning, was prepared to thwart it. So in what direction is the Russian Navy's activities in the world's seas progressing, and where are they located? The Russian Navy has the most diverse submarine fleets in the world. Moscow considers some of these submarines to be capable of launching ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads as an important component of its strategic deterrence. With an estimated 58 ships, the Russian Navy manages one of the largest submarine fleets in the world. However, these ships can be deployed worldwide, which is a valid reason to alarm U.S. commanders. An alarm was also sounded by U.S. Air Force General Glenn Van Herk, the director of U.S. Northern Command and NORAD. They transported their subs the first to the Pacific, Van Herk told the U.S. Army Conference Association. Another is currently in the Mediterranean and another one is moving towards the Atlantic. A month before Van Herk comment, naval analyst Hy Sutton had claimed that Russian Navy forces were being reinforced in the Mediterranean. This may be important given the strategic importance of the region in U.S. calculations. In addition, the USA is trying to strengthen its presence in the Mediterranean. In addition, Rear Admiral Michael Studman, commander of the Naval Intelligence Office, highlighted the risk posed by Russia's Severodvinsk JNS or Yasin class as it is popularly known. There are also Russian submarines in the Pacific and Atlantic. Therefore, it is essential for the United States to follow these submarines and their actions. Thank you for watching us. Ukraine's path to victory passes through the Pearl of the Black Sea, Crimea. Crimea is a key and has a decisive role in this war. Ukraine wants to open its doors to freedom using the Crimean Key. For this purpose, Ukraine is organizing many attacks on Russian positions in Crimea. The last of these was deployed to the second-largest Russian military airbase in the Crimea. So how did the Ukrainian attacks reach the Russian military airbase 240 kilometers from the front line in the Crimea? As Divine Justice, we strive to bring you the most striking news, collective and accurate information from the front, working 24/7 with our expert staff in the fastest way possible. You can subscribe to support us. Unmanned aerial vehicles belonging to Ukraine managed to frighten Vladimir Putin by making a show of strength in the skies of Crimea. The last of these attacks occurred around 1620 local time in the airbase area in Gvardeysk in Crimea, which was temporarily occupied by Russia last day. Mysterious Ukrainian weapons struck and blew up the military airbase 240 kilometers from Russia's front line in Crimea. Local residents reported that explosions were heard and seen again in the temporarily occupied Crimea, this time in the area of the military airbase in the urban-type village of Gvardeysk in Simferopol district. According to local reports, first, a few explosions were heard, then black smoke appeared above the airbase. According to claims by Russian officials, Russian air defense systems hit the UAV. In addition, a large crater was allegedly found at the scene. The diameter of the crater is about 10 to 12 meters, and the depth is about 3.5. The military air base in the village of Gvardeysk received another incurable wound with the attacks by the mysterious vehicles of Ukraine. It is likely that the heroes who carried out this attack were bomb-laden drones when the bombs dropped from the drones hit the military airbase. Huge explosions occurred and the skies of Crimea surrounded to the dark cloud. The Russian authorities have not yet made a statement regarding the casualties resulting from the attack. However, considering the ammunition and soldiers at the airbase, it is a strong possibility that there will be serious casualties. However, it was not specified from which direction the drone flew. Given that the aircraft has successfully covered such a long distance, both from the borders of Ukraine and over the territory of Russia, Ukrainian drones cause serious concerns for Russian officials. The determined stance of the Kiev administration on Crimea is fueling a series of cross-border operations. In addition to the Gvardeysk attack, Sevastopol and Bakhchisarai near Yalta hosted explosions in Berkshire. The engineering warehouse of the military unit of the 758th Logistics Center of the Russian Federation Black Sea Fleet and the warehouse of the 133rd Brigade of the M2 were located. Ukrainian drones targeted these Russian ammunition depots. As a result of the missiles hitting, large clouds of smoke were seen in the skies of Bakhchisarai. The explosion was so strong that the terrifying explosions were heard in many villages of Bakhchisarai district. No official statement has yet been made regarding the casualties caused by the explosion. In addition, according to the claims of Russian state media, air defense systems shot down 6 unmanned aerial vehicles while electronic warfare systems disabled 4. The Russian Ministry of Defense, which is uneasy about the frequent flying of Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles over the skies of Crimea, attracted all the attention with its statements. In his official statement, the Russian defense minister stated that Ukraine is targeting the civilian infrastructure in Crimea and in the depths of Russia. The Ukrainian front did not remain indifferent to these statements. One of Zelensky's chief advisors, Mikhailo Podolyak, denied that Ukraine used drones to attack Russian territory. Writing on the Twitter's social media platform, Podolyak said Ukraine is not attacking the territory of the Russian Federation. Ukraine is waging a defensive war to liberate all of its lands from occupation. In addition, Ukraine's Western allies deterred Ukraine from attacking targets in Russia to prevent the conflict from escalating. Mr. Podolyak's statement may reflect Kiev's attempt to maintain a degree of deniability in light of these Western concerns. At the beginning of the video, we ask you a question: can Ukraine open its doors to freedom using the Crimean Key? The answer to this question would most likely be yes, given the Kiev forces' operations in Crimea. So what strategies can Ukraine use to liberate Crimea? Let's consider these tactics together. To liberate Crimea means to make the peninsula untenable for the Russian army, navy, and air force. A large-scale offensive accompanied by precision strikes and shelling against Russian air, ground, and naval forces could help drive Putin's men out of Crimea. This concerto attack on the peninsula would be a major blow to Russia's morale to isolate and neutralize it and seriously damage its military infrastructure with long-range attacks in the absence of decisive war success. Elsewhere, the liberation of Crimea would mean an undisguised defeat for Moscow and could lead to the collapse of Russian forces on the ground and even the downfall of Putin. In addition, Kiev can isolate the omni-terrestrial communication line connecting Crimea to Russia using long-range precision strikes. Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to Russia via Mariupol and Melitopol along the Azov Sea coastline. This bridge is very important in the land communication line. Targeting this transport infrastructure will initiate the isolation of Crimea from supply or movement. Let us remind you that the Kerch Bridge was severely damaged months ago. A large Ukrainian armored force attacking southeast in the direction of the Sea of Azov and penetrating the Russian linear defenses will complete the isolation of Crimea and enable the closer deployment of HIMARS rocket launchers, which will then be within range of key Russian installations in Crimea. Crimea is the size of Massachusetts. There is no place to hide. The location of all Russian facilities are well known. Russian facilities are open and vulnerable, while on the other hand, sensitive attacks on Sevastopol may force the Black Sea Fleet to relocate to Novorossiysk, which is much less capable as a base and is further away from Ukrainian cities. If Ukraine wants Crimea, it must make the Saki air base on the west coast of Crimea completely unusable. The logistics center in Sankawi in the north of Crimea should turn into a huge bonfire once Crimea becomes untenable. Ukrainian ground forces may begin to attack south to the Isthmus of Perekop and then to the wider Crimea. Special forces, Marines, unmanned systems are assets that will play an important role in Ukraine's Crimean operation. We touched upon the strategies that Ukraine will use to liberate Crimea. However, another detail that is as important as strategy in war is ammunition for the Crimean offensive. Ukraine needs long-range attack capabilities such as the attack, a surface-to-surface missile with a range of 190 miles. The West will also need to provide other equipment that will allow the Ukrainians to deploy a large armored force capable of penetrating enemy lines without being blown up by mines or stranded in trenches dug by Russians. But there is no consensus among Western countries on providing Ukraine with long-range weapons. Few believe that Russia will resort to a tactical nuclear strike, but many worry that any weapon that could potentially be used by Ukraine to launch an attack inside Russia's territory could increase the risk of escalation and plunge other Western countries into a direct war. As a result, Zelensky realized that the Crimean wound must now be cauterized. Failure to retake the peninsula would mean an ongoing threat to Ukrainian state identity and global security. Zelensky continues to fight with all his might to destroy these threats. With Ukraine's determination to retake Crimea and Russia's insistence that it will defend it, it may only be a matter of time before this conflict turns into a battlefield reality. Tensions between the US and Russia have escalated while the whole world was waiting for the war between Russia and Ukraine to end. The war between the US and Russia has begun. The US Air Force shot down Russian leader Vladimir Putin's favorite fighter jet in the Baltic Sea. The US, which has been providing military equipment and financial support to the Ukrainian army since the beginning of the war, has come face to face with Russia in recent weeks. Tensions between the US and Russia have increased after a US Air Force drone was shot down in the Black Sea. The Russian government initially denied shooting down the US drone. However, the US government proved that Russian warplanes had shot down the US drone, with images obtained from the wreckage of the downed drone. A few days after this incident, the Pentagon decided to send US warplanes to the Baltic Sea. US officials warned the Finnish government after Russian President Vladimir Putin began deploying troops to the Finnish border after Finland's accession to NATO. Vladimir Putin began to deploy troops and tanks to the Finnish border. Not only that, Putin sent Russian Navy ships to the port of St. Petersburg and started making threatening moves against Finland. The US government took action after Finnish President Sauli Niinisto said that the Russian army was very close to the Finnish border and he was worried that Vladimir Putin might attempt a new invasion. With the order of US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, to B-52H fighter jets of the US Air Force moved towards the Baltic Sea. The American warplanes, which were sent to locate the Russian Navy ships anchored in the Baltic Sea, were exposed to the threat of the Russian Air Force. The US warplanes, which entered the radar of the Russian air defense systems, alarmed Russia with the order of the Russian Defense Ministry as U-35 fighter jets of the air defense units of the Western Military District took action on the grounds that US warplanes violated Russia's borders. Russian fighter jets approached the US warplanes hovering over the Baltic Sea and called on them to turn back. After this call by the Russian pilots, the US warplanes left the Baltic Sea and moved away from the region. The Russian Defense Ministry later said in a statement that they did not allow the violation of Russia's borders and that they had to repel the US warplanes in accordance with international rules. However, the harassment of US aircraft by Russian warplanes was not welcomed by the US Defense Ministry. A few days after this incident, the US Air Force F-35 fighter jets destroyed a Su-35 fighter jets of the Russian Air Force. The F-35 fighter jets, the most popular fighter jets of the US, are known as stealth fighters. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin stated that US planes sent for reconnaissance in the past days were harassed by Russian fighter jets, but this time they will organize a reconnaissance flight in the region with F-13 fighter jets, stating that they will not allow Vladimir Putin's aggressive behavior against Finland, which is on the way to becoming a NATO member country. The US Defense Secretary stated that they have to monitor the movements of the Russian army shortly after the defense minister's statement. F-35 fighter jets moved towards the Baltic Sea. 3 F-35 fighter jets entered the Baltic Sea airspace and started flying near Finland and Russia. American pilots saw Russian Navy ships leaving the port of St. Petersburg and realized that Russian ships were anchored off the coast of Finland, while the US pilots were reporting the situation. And as U-35 fighter jet of the Russian Air Force suddenly appeared, the Russian Su-35 fighter jet, which was chasing the US warplanes, told the US pilots that they had violated the border and asked them to leave the area quickly. Although US warplanes fly in international airspace, Russia does not want US warplanes in the Baltic region. US pilots who refused to leave the region were subjected to harassment by the Russian fighter jet. The Russian pilot, flying very close to the US warplanes, caused the US pilots to lose patience, unable to withstand the harassment of the Russian fighter jet any longer. The American pilots used jammers to disrupt the Russian fighter jets' radar, vision, and systems. The Russian pilot was forced to land at the military airport in St. Petersburg after the systems failed. However, the Russian pilot had problems landing on the runway due to the jammer used by the US fighter jets. The Russian fighter jet, whose landing gear did not work, had to crash on the runway. The Russian fighter jet, which drifted on the runway for a long time, was able to stop by hitting the sand at the end of the runway. After the plane crashed, the Russian pilot barely saved himself from the flames. After the Russian fighter jet crashed, US fighter jets left the Baltic Sea and returned to the US airspace. Russian media reported that the Su-35 fighter jet was shot down by the US and that the US was trying to start a war with Russia. However, it was the Russian fighter jet that first harassed the US fighter jets. The jammer used by the American pilots damaged the landing gear of the Russian fighter jet, causing it to crash. Many war analysts say this was deliberate and that the US retaliated after Russia shot down a US drone. While the whole world was waiting for the war between Russia and Ukraine to come to an end, such a move by the US surprised everyone. Although the US has provided many military equipment support for the Ukrainian army, this is the first time it has officially damaged a Russian military vehicle. Could the ongoing conflict between the US and Russia be the beginning of a new war? Researchers say that a third world war is inevitable if tensions between the US and Russia continue. This time, however, the war will not only be between the US and Russia, but between all allies. If the US goes to war with Russia, NATO member states will also have to get involved. However, many believe that Russia is too weak to fight another war. The Russian army, which has occupied Ukrainian territory for more than a year, has lost more than 165,000 soldiers. The Russian army, which has lost military equipment such as many tanks, armored vehicles and ammunition, is quite exhausted. According to allegations, the Russian army has consumed more than 50% of its ammunition inventory. In fact, Russia's request for military equipment support from allied countries such as Iran, Syria, and Belarus proves this. In addition, the Russian people are not ready for another war. While the majority of Russian citizens want the Russian army to withdraw from Ukrainian territory, it seems unlikely that Vladimir Putin will go to war with America. The recent explosions and fires in Russia are also putting Vladimir Putin under a lot of pressure. While the Russian people's trust in Putin is decreasing over time, the Russian leader is trying to regain the trust of the Russian people. However, after the recent allegations that a new mobilization decision will be announced in Russia, the Russian people are in a very uneasy situation. Putin, who forcibly included 300,000 Russian citizens in the Russian army in the previous partial mobilization decision, now wants to include 500,000 more Russian citizens in the Russian army by declaring a full mobilization decision. But if this happens, it will lead to a major uprising in Russia. Do you think Vladimir Putin can afford a new uprising of the Russian people in the streets?